Thanks a lot, Dale. Appreciate that. We're going to continue in our study that we began last week. So you can go ahead and open your Bibles. We'll begin by rereading Micah 6, verses 6 through 8. And that is really serving as the jumping off point for the lesson that, as I say, we started last week. We'll finish it here today. And you'll remember in Micah 6, beginning at verse number 6, the prophet says, What shall I come before, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? We talked about last week how this represented the attitude of the people in Micah's day, that they seemed to think God was just too oppressive, that God was just asking too much. You'll notice the series of sacrifices that they are theorizing of bringing to God get increasingly larger until it culminates in the absurd, the sacrifice of their own children, giving a human sacrifice to serve God. Of course, we know the absurdity of such, but it's a reflection of the attitude of the people of Micah's day, where they seem to think that God is just too oppressive, that you just can't please God. It doesn't matter what you do. He's got all these rules, and no matter how you try to comply, you're not going to be able to comply completely. You're not going to be perfect. You're going to make mistakes, and it's just impossible to please him. You just give and give and give, and God never seems to be satisfied. And so that's what we used as kind of our starting point by asking this question. Well, what is it that it does take to please God? Is God asking too much? Is he impossible to please? And so we started by looking, we're going to talk about two extremes. We looked at one of those extremes last week, and that's the extreme of hypocrisy. And we showed how hypocrisy was really people who thought they were serving God, who considered themselves to be religious, but they were hypocrites. They were fake. And they were really serving the creature rather than the creator. And that really, I think, sums up the problem that we focused on last week. Paul points out in Romans 1:25 that you had people there who served the creature rather than the creator. That's how they saw religion. That's how they saw serving God. It became a means of serving themselves rather than serving God. And they were just fooling themselves into thinking, oh yeah, we're religious, we're serving God. But as Jesus points out, as Paul points out, and really that's the same point that Micah is making back in Micah 6, that they were hypocritical. As I said, this is very similar to what Jesus encountered with the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Drew's doing an excellent job in the adult class here in the auditorium on Sunday mornings going over the parables, and we see that firsthand in parable after parable of this kind of hypocrisy, especially among the religious elite, that they were just very hypocritical in their behavior, and it blinded them. It tricked them into thinking that they were very religious, that they were serving God, but as we see over and over and over again, they were really just serving themselves. Religion became a function of fulfilling their own desires of what they wanted, and that was a problem, that God's not pleased with that kind of worship. And so you want to avoid that extreme of hypocrisy, especially defining hypocrisy as self-service, seeing worship, seeing church as a means of satisfying what you want, what your expectations are. Here's the kind of church that I want to be a part of. That really is separate and apart from what God is saying. Well, here's what I want. So it's the idea of serving the creature rather than the creator that is problematic. And that's what the people back in Micah's time are struggling with. That's what so many in the days of Jesus struggle with. And sadly, it's what so many today struggle with. And so we're going to go on from that and look at the second extreme, in which it's very similar, but it manifests itself slightly differently in that it's just looking at it's impossible to please God. He's just so demanding. So, what's the point of even trying? And this too is very common today. And it's not just in the idea that, God's being unreasonable with all these requests, asking for more and more and more. It's often manifesting itself in a sense of our own inability to really offer to God what he's asking, that we are not capable, that it's beyond our capacity to give. And as you can see, that I think is very much embedded in the attitude of the people in Micah's day in verses 6 and 7, where they, bring out this increasingly large, sacrifices that they're going to try to placate God with, and it becomes absurd. What 10,000 rivers of oil? Who can bring that to God? And then, of course, culminating in the most absurd of all, the idea of giving their children as human sacrifices to God. And so that, I think, reflects this attitude that, it's just impossible. You just can't please God. He's got all these rules and they're impossible to keep. So, why even try? But it also expresses itself in this idea that, I'm incapable of doing that. And we have lots of biblical examples of individuals who felt, unqualified, incapable of serving God and giving to God what God was asking from them to give. Moses is a great example of this idea that he just doesn't have the ability to do the things that God is asking of him. In Exodus, the 4th chapter, this is where God comes to Moses and tells him, you need to go back down into Egypt and set my people free. And that begins with a series of excuses that Moses is trying to point out to God that, I just can't do that. It's just beyond my capability, that those, you're asking the impossible from me because I don't have those kind of talents. I don't have that ability to do that. And so you'll see this series of excuses that God is hearing from the lips of Moses as he's trying desperately to avoid the calling that God has placed upon him to go back to Egypt and set God's people free. In Exodus 4, verse number 1, then Moses answered and said, but suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say, the Lord has not appeared to you. And so I can understand this. What Moses is basically saying is, Lord, what do you expect me to do? I've been 40 years since I left Egypt. I'm just going to waltz back down there and say, come on, everybody, follow me. We're going to the promised land. Why? They're going to think I'm a nutball. And of course, God says, well, don't worry about that. I'll give you the abilities. You can read on your own and look at how God responds to that. God says, I'll give you miraculous powers. And those miraculous powers will demonstrate to the people that I have chosen you. They'll demonstrate to the people that you're legitimate. The miracles that you'll be able to perform will prove to them that you have been sent by me. Well, Moses is still not done. He still is very sure that this is just something he cannot do. So you continue on down to verse number 10. He offers up a second excuse. Then Moses said to the Lord, oh, my Lord, I'm not eloquent, neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. It is difficult. They say that one of the most common fears of all people is public speaking, that's really intimidating. And that's very understandable. And so I think again we can sympathize with Moses. Yeah, that's a good excuse. I mean, I can't talk. I'm slow of tongue. I can't, this happens to me all the time. I'm a preacher. I'll get involved in a Bible discussion with somebody who maybe isn't a member, and they'll say something, and I'll kind of fumble around looking for words, how to respond. And, an hour later when I'm driving away in my car, oh, that's what I should have. Did that ever happen to you? Oh, that's what I should have said. See? So again, I can identify with Moses. I can understand that in him saying, I'm just not a good talker. I'm going to be going to Pharaoh. I'm going to be standing in the court of all of these officials, the highest of the highest, the most educated, the smartest people in Egypt. And I don't know what to say to these guys. Well, God, again, go read that in your own time at home. Go ahead and see what God responds. Says, listen, you've got a brother, Aaron. I'll give you Aaron. He's a really good speaker. He'll be your mouthpiece. He'll speak for you. And so what we're seeing is that every excuse that Moses is offering up, God is responding, saying, don't let that, Moses, you think you're not able to do this? Don't worry. I've got you covered. You're going to do just fine. Finally, we look down at verse 13, and this is, I think, utter exasperation now on the part of Moses when he responds. But he said, "Oh Lord, please send by the hand of whomever else you may send." Basically, he's saying, listen, I don't want to go. Just you've chosen the wrong guy. Pick anybody else, but please don't pick me. And basically, this I think is getting to the core problem that Moses is really suffering from, and I think that core problem is just unwillingness. I just don't want to do it. And I think that that is a fair representation of a lot of the excuses that we make today when we feel ourselves called by God to do something specific, where He's asking us to do something like maybe go invite somebody to come to church, invite them to come to the Bible classes that we're having, the edification meeting, the ladies' Bible class, so forth and so. Just invite them. And I don't know. I'm going to say something stupid. It's just not. It's just not. I'm just not. That's just not my thing. And really, we can manufacture all these excuses in the same way that Moses did. And when you peel back the layer of the onions there on all those excuses, what is really at the core is a simple unwillingness. I just don't want to do that. Okay. And that's very much the problem. So a lot of times this idea of, well, it's impossible is just kind of a smokescreen. And we can see that with Moses here. These are just a series of excuses that really are dealing with the problem of, I just don't want to do it. We have so many passages in the scripture that weigh against that show, we don't need to think that way. We don't have to worry about that. God is never going to ask us to do anything that is beyond our capacity to accomplish. Look over in 1 Corinthians, the 13th chapter, down at verse number 10. Here, the Apostle Paul points out there that, actually, I think I got that backwards. Let me see here. I think it's 10:13, 1 Corinthians 10. I think that will work better. Yes. So the guy that made that made a mistake the same way his wife did. So it both proves that the Dent family can make mistakes. Okay, that should say 1 Corinthians 10:13. 1 Corinthians 10:13. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond that which you are able, but with the temptation will also make a way of escape that you may be able to bear it. Now, this passage is dealing mainly with temptation, but it also, I think, illustrates the fact that God's just not going to put any burden on us that we're not capable of carrying on our own. That's just not how God operates. He's making this promise. There's always a way that we can accomplish the thing that God wants us to accomplish, whether it's overcoming temptation or whether it's dealing with something that is intimidating to us. We kind of know we ought to be doing it, but really we don't want to do it. And we have passages such as this that reassure us time and time again. Likewise, we have parables that teach this same principle, and so far as it shows that God recognizes that we all have differing capabilities. The parable of the talents, you can turn over to Matthew, the 25th chapter. We're just going to look at one verse. We don't have time to take this beautiful parable apart, but it will illustrate this very important idea that we have varying talents, we have varying capacities, and God totally gets that. He's not going to ask us to do something that goes beyond our ability to accomplish that thing. And so in Matthew 25 at verse number 15, and to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1. So he's setting up this parable of the talents. Notice here the operative phrase is to each according to his own ability. So at the beginning of the parable, each servant is doled out talents. Now, a little different than how we use that word talent. We use the word talent to talk about a specific ability that we're typically good at. Back then, a talent was a weight of measure, and it's a substantial weight of measure. So it would be if it was a talent of gold, even the 1 talent man would be receiving over $1 million worth of gold. So imagine the 5 talent man, that he's given a lot of resources, a lot of money. So the point to understand here, though, and what we're taking from this particular passage is the idea that God is understanding the various abilities that we have, and he's not going to overburden us. He recognizes that we have different abilities. He recognizes this. And he understands that different people have differing talents. So he doesn't expect, as you go through the parable, you'll see that the master does not expect the same level of accomplishment in the 1 talent man as he does the 5 talent man, for instance. So that's important for us to keep in mind as we think of this as well. We don't want to use our what we perceive as our relative lack of talent to do nothing. Now, that's the mistake that the 1 talent man did. What did the 1 talent man do with his talent? He buried it. He did nothing. And so that's a real key that we begin to understand. Well, let's do something. As we end up here at the conclusion, we'll talk about 3 very simple things that anybody can do that is within the capacity. It doesn't matter if you're the 1 talent man. It doesn't matter if you're the 2 talent man. It doesn't matter if you're the 5 talent. It doesn't matter. None of that matters. We can all do these 3 things. But notice, first of all, that God recognizes that we have varying capabilities. He doesn't require. You may look around and say, well, I can't do that. I can't get up in front of people and preach. I can't, whatever, The idea is that you realize that God recognizes that we have varying capacities and varying talents. And so we can look at other passages that really show what is the important idea. And what is the important idea is that whatever you have, you need to use it with the view towards growth. In Hebrews, the 5th chapter, verse number 12, he is kind of getting on to the recipients of the Hebrew letter here. He says to them, for though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and have become in need of milk and not solid food. So the underlying principle there is just the principle of growth. That's what the Hebrew writer is saying to the recipients of this letter, is that, you should have grown by this period of time. You should start having some spiritual growth. And yet you haven't. You have to go back over and kind of relearn the spiritual ABCs all over again because you haven't grown. This is a principle that we see all through Scripture, repeated time and time again. First Peter 1, we can turn over there. First Peter 2, rather, and verse number 2. As newborn babes desire the pure milk of the word, that you may grow thereby. So that's the operative idea, the idea of growth. Indeed, you may not be as talented in some endeavor as the brother or sister who's sitting right next to you, but you can grow. You can do that. Maybe you don't know as much about the Bible as somebody else here may know, but that's largely immaterial. The idea that you see time and time again is do not allow your relative lack of ability in any area to become an excuse to do nothing, to bury that talent. If we're not careful, that's kind of what had afflicted the people in Micah's time. That's kind of what had afflicted a lot of the people in Jesus' time. And it's afflicting a lot of people today, that this idea of allowing what I perceive to be my relative lack of talent to be an excuse to do nothing. The point is that we can grow. So those are the two extremes, the idea of hypocrisy and the idea of impossibility. Let's wrap this up with just a basic point when we talk about what it is that we really want to accomplish. We've been talking about what does it take to please God, and I'd like to suggest that what it takes to please God is really a slightly different focus. It's not really about pleasing God. So we've got to really understand, well, what's the real goal here? And there's an underlying goal that I think is more foundational. There is an underlying goal that is more important. And what I think that goal is service. That's that. Instead of just thinking of pleasing God, what we need to think about is service to God. And when you go back, we can look at Micah after he talks about, this sad attitude that so many of his contemporaries had during his ministry back in Old Testament times. In Micah 6 at verse number 8, he gives answer to, how they can overcome this sense that God is just too oppressive, that God's asking too much. And he does so by pointing out, when you stop and think about it, it's really very simple. There's three things that God is saying, here's how you can serve me. And by serving me, then that becomes the means by which we do indeed please him. But it's through this concept of understanding the idea of service. And that's what I think he's really trying to show them in his response to their attitude of, God is just overbearing. He's asking more than we can give. In answer to that, Micah 6:8, he has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. It's those three simple things that is within the capacity of every person in this room. The first thing he talks about is the importance of doing justly. Let's go back to chapter number 2, maybe get a little better idea of what Micah thought that really means. What does it mean to do justly? Well, he's berating his brethren here in Micah 2:1. Woe to those who devise iniquity and work out evil on their beds. At morning light they practice it, because it is in the power of their hand. So there's a lot of ways that we could talk about this concept of biblical justice, but primarily what you're going to see, over and over and over again is people who are in a relative position of power and authority, and they are abusing that power and authority. It doesn't matter where it's at. It could be on the job. It could be in the workplace. It could be in the fact that you're part of society. Maybe you've been born into a wealthy family. Back in Micah's time, society and cultures tended to be much more static than it is today, but we still have lots of people today that resent the wealthy and the elite because they see them kind of having an advantage over them. And what do the wealthy and elite often do with that advantage? Do they exploit it a little bit? They take advantage of that position of power that they have, and that's what we see over and over and over again. And so that's just one way that we can understand this idea of justice, that in the various positions of power that we may occupy, that we don't turn that to our own self-fulfilling agenda. Look in Psalms. In Psalms 82, we want to look down at verse number 3, where he talks about, let me get back over there. Psalm 82:3, where he encourages, defend the poor and the fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and the needy. Now that's a theme that you just see popping up over and over and over again in the Old Testament, in the New Testament. The idea of not taking advantage of your relative position of power. And again, don't just think about wealthy people. There's every likelihood that you right now occupy some position of relative power. You're a husband. Well, what does God say the husband is relative to the rest of the family? Say you're the leader? Well, again, as a husband, what do you think that empowers you to do? And how do you show forth that leadership, you see? And do you take advantage of that? Or are you following the example of Christ, who showed his leadership through sacrifice? Christ's idea of leadership was to say, if there's any sacrificing to do in this house, I go first. Isn't that what he said? Isn't that kind of what he did? Yeah. So again, or maybe at your workplace. Maybe at your workplace, you're in a position of relative power. You might not be the boss, you might not own the company, but you might be in position of power over some of the other workers there. Again, how do you see that? How do you use that? And that's what Micah's talking about. You have to understand the concept of justice, and that over and over and over again, as far as the Bible is concerned, just comes back to how you use the power that you have and the authority that you have in the various aspects of life and the various roles that you may fulfill. Don't exploit that power. Now that's totally capable. It doesn't have anything to do with whether you see yourself as equivalent to a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. You may not have anything close, but you do, in all likelihood, occupy some relative position of power. The question is, how do you use that? And that's what he's saying. Don't use it for self-gain. Don't use it for your own benefit. The next thing he talks about back in Micah 6:8 is to love kindness or mercy. Again, this is a principle that we see embedded. It's mentioned 2 different occasions. Jesus mentions it in the Sermon on the Mount. That's what we're going to be looking at here. First at Matthew 5 and verse number 7, where in the famous Beatitudes, he says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. So it's the idea that we show forth mercy and able to receive the mercy from God. A little bit later on in the 6th chapter, he reiterates this same concept in Matthew 6, verses 14 and 15. In the model prayer that he gives the disciples here, he says, for if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. So the fundamental idea here is that we're understanding that we've been forgiven. When we became Christians, we were forgiven. We want to give as good as we got. And so we want to have that same disposition. We're going to work against not bearing grudges. We're going to work against not seeking vengeance when we've been wronged. You're going to be wronged. You live in a broken and dysfunctional world. That's the price of sin. And sometimes it's just plain not going to be fair. So that's what you need to think about. Well, how do I deal with that unfairness? And we're told over and over again, don't seek vengeance, be forgiving, uh, don't bear a grudge. That's within your capacity. It doesn't matter if you're not the president of the United States and you don't have the ability just to pick up a pen and pardon somebody. Our president just pardoned somebody last week. He has the power. Well, I don't have that power. Yes, you do. You do. You might not have the power relative to the president, but you have power to forgive. And that's what he's asking. That's not beyond your capacity. That's not impossible for you to do. You can do that. And God's saying it's very simple. You want to please me, will understand how important it is to serve me, and you serve me by showing forth the same kind of love and mercy that I showed to you. You show that to others, and you will serve me. And then finally, he says, walk humbly with your God. There's all kinds of passages. Again, this is all through both the Old Testament and the New Testament. We'll look here in Isaiah 57, and we want to look at verse number 15. Again, just one of the basic concepts that's, as I say, repeated all through the Old Testament and the New Testament. For thus says the high and lofty one who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy, I dwell in the high holy places with him. So this is God saying, this is the person I dwell with. I dwell with him who has a contrite and humble spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble. See, that's how you see yourself. My job is to not only be humble in my attitude towards God and in my walk with God, but I also have the attitude of wanting to revive the spirit of those who have been humbled, those who are suffering, those who are overcome by power. That's what I see my job. My job is to help those people be lifted up and feel that they're worth something and that they have value, just like God made me feel that I have value, that he would say, hey, I want to walk with you. I want you to come over. You come over to my house, you hang around with me. Okay. There's a lot of people that I'm sure God didn't want to hang around with. There's people I don't want to hang around with. There's people who are loud and obnoxious. They're braggarts. You hang around those kind of people much? Maybe you say, yeah, I work with them. Okay. Well, that's the point, is you understand it's not well, God doesn't like hanging around those people either. So who does he like hanging around with? This person who's humble. Okay. We can go over to the New Testament, Hebrews, the 11th chapter. And in many ways, this is my favorite verse because it illustrates exactly this concept of walking with God. This fellow by the name of Enoch, we don't know a whole lot about him, but he's mentioned as one of the heroes of faith in Hebrews, the 11th chapter. Let's look at verse number 5, where he's mentioned, by faith, Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death, and was not found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony that he what? Are you reading that verse? That he pleased God. Now that captured my attention because that's the sermon I wanted to preach on. Enoch pleased God, and the text says he had testimony that he what? That he pleased God. So I thought, well, that'd be kind of neat to see. What's that testimony? And you have to go back again. It doesn't say a whole lot about him, but I think it's extremely profound. You go back to Genesis, the 5th chapter. And Genesis, the 5th chapter, look at verse number 22, Genesis 5:22. I keep pressing the wrong buttons here on my phone. Genesis 5:22. And it says, and after he begot Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and had sons and daughters. It's that short little phrase. Enoch walked with God for how long? 300 years. Now, of course, those people, especially before the flood, and even to a much more limited extent briefly after the flood, they tended to have much longer lifespans than we do today. But I'm thinking walking with God for 300 years is a pretty good track record. Okay. So what that tells me is persistence. That this idea that is the same exact idea that you see in Micah 6:8, walking with God. Who's the example that we have that? We have Enoch, and what we are told about him is he did it for 300 years. To me, that emphasizes the concept of persistence. Now, you're not going to be perfect. Even after you become a Christian, you're going to mess up every once in a while. You're going to sin every once in a while. And what does it take to please God? What it takes is having the humility to admit it. I remember a Bible class we had some time ago. Don was in the Bible class. We were talking about this very thing, about this ability to, be willing to show forth humility. And when you sin, admit it. And Don made the comment, yeah, when you mess up, fess up. And I remembered that. I thought, man, I'm going to work that into a sermon. That's a good statement. Thanks, Don, for sharing that idea. It's so easy to remember that, isn't it? When you mess up, fess up. That's what walking humbly with God's all about. And so you're able to admit your mistake, but then there's this idea of persistence. You admit your mistake, you ask for forgiveness, and then you get back to what? Walking with who? Walking with God. Now, there you go. Now, there's not a person in this room that this is going to be impossible for. All these things, to do justly, that is to show forth justice to the people around about you, especially those who are in more difficult situations than you might be. To love kindness and mercy, see. To show forth forgiveness and a willingness for not bearing a grudge. To walk humbly with God, that is to admit your mistake when you make it, ask God for forgiveness, and then get back to that walk. That's within the power of each and every one of us. And it's simple. It's relatively simple to do. And this is what it boils down to. What's the goal? The goal is to serve God. And by remembering Micah 6:8, we can do just that. Perhaps this morning you are in a position where you realize, you know what, I can do that. I can do justly. I can exercise whatever authority I may have in a way that reflects the image of God, that I'm going to try to be a person in a position of authority the same way Jesus was, the same way God was. I'm going to be in love with kindness and have a willingness to forgive. And I want to walk humbly with my God. You can do that. Come forward here, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized. Maybe you've already done that, but realize that your walk has taken you away from the Lord. Exercise your ability to come back, ask for God's forgiveness, walk humbly with him, and make that commitment to come back and serve him. If there's any way we can be of help or spiritual encouragement to you this morning, come forward, make those wishes known while together we stand and sing.